Hey, what's up to everybody out there? Welcome to another edition of the Roundtable Talk. I am your host, C Money, and in today's episode, I want to talk about a topic that may not be useful to everybody, but I just something that I've been meaning to get into and try to figure out. And I want to talk about generation names. And if you don't know what I mean about generation names, meaning that what generation you was born in. You know, there are several generations, and the generation I didn't know that I was born into a generation. And when I was looking into it, I thought I was born into a certain generation, which I wasn't, because now I know that this generation is different from other generations. We're gonna go down the list of generations. First off, before I get into this, let's say rest in peace to the Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket. I've been seeing that all through my social media timeline, that the iconic Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket, even though it's not iconic, closed this weekend at Universal Studios in Orlando to make way for a new attraction. And all down my timeline, I've been seeing a lot of people talking about it. I've only rode that roller coaster one time back in 2018, when I first started getting into the thrill of riding roller coasters. It was a scary experience, and I was supposed to ride it again in 2020, but due to a situation, I couldn't ride it. Not gonna get into the situation. It's nothing personal, nothing bad, but just rest in peace, Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket. You have lived on to be one of the greatest roller coasters at Universal Studios, and hopefully, whatever they replace it with will be something better. And so let's go back to what we were talking about. The first up is called the Lost Generation of 1914. Now, I don't know nothing about that, because those are not nothing really. The Greatest Generation is from 1901 to 1927. That's a generation which I don't really know. The Silent Generation was from 1928 until 1945. Don't know about that. This one I do know about. Is called Baby Boomers, which is from 1946 to 1964. Now, my mom is part of the Silent Generation. So, and I know about the Baby Boomers. I've heard that term before. And 1946 and 1964, I don't know anybody of that nature that's in that generation. Generation X, or Gen X for short, is from 1965 to 1980. Now, this is with me and all of my siblings, because my siblings was 70s babies, and I'm an 80s baby because I was born 1980. For now, the year I was born. And for when I first heard of, which is the next one, which y'all all know is millennials, I always thought that millennials, when I first heard of millennials, I always thought millennials was people of 2000 and later, because, the millennial, Y2K and all of that stuff. So I always thought that millennials was something like 2000, 2001, 2002, things like that. But when I started doing millennials, it was like from the 80s on down to the 90s. And I'm like, I'm a millennial. But then when I saw it the other day, I did digger research. Millennials started at 1981 to 1996, and I was like, I'm not a millennial. And a person that I work with, and she was like, she's 1979, which is a Gen X, and she was like, I'm adjacent to a millennial because I act like a millennial and all that stuff. And I thought I was a millennial, but apparently I am a Gen X. And I'm like, I thought I was a millennial. And I didn't know millennials was the 80s kid and the 90s kids. I thought millennials was more like 2000s and stuff like that. So that came to show you. Now, Gen Z is from 1997 to early 2010s. So I thought today's modern day people now are Gen Zs, because I hear that word all the time, Gen Z, Gen Z. So I'm thinking, okay, so if you're 2020, 2021, 2019, 2018, things like that, you are a Gen Z. But I realized, Gen Zs are 90s are mid 90s to late 90s, early 2000 babies. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know, because I thought millennials was the early 2000s and Gen Zs was the later 2000s, and it kind of caught me off guard. And now, another one, Generation Alpha, which is 2013 on down. And Generation Beta is supposed to be next, which is now 2025 to 2039. And that's supposed to be the later ones. So now we're in Generation Beta, because last year we was in Generation Alpha. Now I was looking at all of this and I'm like, what does all of this mean? I guess it's more of a like a birth logical saying. Was you a baby boomer? Was you a Gen Z? Was you a Gen X? Was you a millennial? Was you this? Because these are, to me, these are a slang for generations. These are slangs for people to identify themselves. I'm a Gen X, apparently. I thought it was a millennial, and I didn't know that millennial existed back in the 80s. I thought millennials was late 90s, early 2000s, or the mid 2000s, and Gen Z was the later 2000s, as I said earlier. And I looked at it and I'm like, wow, millennials are actually 80s. So a lot of my younger cousins and family members and stuff, if you're in your early 40s, if you are 30s, you're a millennial. And I'm like, okay, I thought millennials was people that was in their 20s, 2000s, 2010, 2000, and then like now modern day life is Gen Z, because I always thought, what is Gen Z? What is Gen Z? And I keep thinking that, and it was a term that just came out, and I'm like, okay, so I'm thinking Gen Z is like the new modern day, baby boomers, like babies and stuff like that. But no, Gen Z's been out since the 2000s. I'm like, what? So, there's a lot. And then, of course, by 2039, there's going to be another name out, because apparently Generation Beta is supposed to be the next, beta for kids, and because we're now in Generation Beta from 2025 to 2039. So, things like that. And I always often, like, what? And I was like, okay, there are things that, we don't know. There are things that, that it's different for us. Like how we define our births with zoological signs like Scorpio, Cancer, Taurus, Libra, Leos, and things like that. This is the same thing. We define our ages and our stages. 19 from the 80s is millennials, the 90s are Gen Zs, the 2000s were generation something. There was also Generation Y, and I'm trying to figure out where was that. Oh, millennials is also known as Generation Y, because it's because you have Generation X, you have Generation Y, and then you have Generation Z. But Generation Y was also referred to as millennials. So yeah, but for a lot of you may not think of this, because I was having a conversation with somebody, and because there's another saying out there called YN, and I always often tried to figure out what YN meant, and I thought it meant youngin, because I see a lot of people say YNs, and I was like, what is a YN? And I always thought it meant youngins, meaning that's a new term that they define young people that are in their teenage years or early adulthood, in their early 20s or in their 20s, to where that's what they refer to them, YNs. And then a friend of mine, excuse my language, I don't like to use type of profile language, or any type of language that may be obscenity to some people, but a friend of mine was saying YN means young niggas. And I was like, what? I always thought it meant youngins, because Y is the beginning of the word, and N is towards the end of the word, which will be YN mean youngin. But perfectly mean young niggas. Y for the young and N for the niggas. So, there's a lot that we all have to learn because there's a lot of words. You see these, you know, a lot of these rappers and actors, they have come, why, NLE Chopper, YN, Young Boy, and all these other, things like that. So you're looking at it, and there's a lot of phrases that are out there because there's a lot that, as us, I'm in my 40s, so as us, we don't know or we don't know to keep up with these terms. I go every now and then. I go to Urban Dictionary because Urban Dictionary, if you, it's kind of like the dictionary, but it's a dictionary that explains certain types of words that you would not commonly see in the dictionary. So you have to go to the Urban Dictionary. You're not going to see YN in the dictionary. You're going to be like, what's YN? And you're not going to see Gen X or Gen Y and stuff like that. Wikipedia is another one too that you can go to because that's where I get some of my resources from as well too. And you have to be like, what is this and what is that? Because if you go out there and somebody say, look at all these YNs, what's up with these YNs? And then older person will be like, what is he talking about? What is a YN? Is that a new hip hop slang? And so you got to look at certain these things. And I wanted to do an episode about this because I was talking to one of my friends that I was like, yeah, this should be a thesis of my episode because now I'm looking at it as if no one has really ever had, well, that I know of, can sit up and actually talk about generation verification, because these are basically generation verification. Are you a baby boomer? Are you a Gen Z? Are you a Gen X? Are you a millennial? Are you, this? Are you that? Because there are a lot of generations out there. My mom was a was a baby boomer, if I'm not mistaken. No, my mom was a silent generation. She was because she was born in the early 40s, and I look at it as say, there are a lot of names out there, but we don't look at the earlier names like the silent generation. We start with baby boomers. That's when we start up because I've heard that term a lot of times. So we start with that, but a lot of people. There are a lot of generations beforehand, and I did all the list as you saw earlier in the show. And you got the silent generation, you got the greatest generation, the lost generation. You got a lot of these. So it's like we don't really take heed to that because when people, a lot of people, and I was talking about this the other day at work, and we was talking about Gen Z and Generation X and all that, and I was like, I said I thought millennials was like 2000s because when they be talking about the new millennial, you think about Y2K, and then with millennials you think, okay, maybe these are the youngins that are out here and that was born in the early 2000s, the late 90s, and these are the millennials, and now this and that. And then now from 2010 or 2015 on down, we are Gen Zs and all that. But I didn't know millennials, which is Generation Y, which is basically the generation of me. I grew up as an 80s baby, even though I'm not a millennial because millennial starts at 1981 and I was born in 1980. So that gives you, and I'm not going to say my age. If I was born in 1980, you should pinpoint my age, and I'm not going to tell you my birth date, because I don't want you to, pinpoint, but you should know around the age I am. But I'm basically I'm a Generation X, and I was shocked, but I want to know what y'all think about this. I wasn't planning on, this was a topic that kind of kept me off guard because I never experienced this, like having a conversation about this, because I just knew Gen Zs and Generation X is called, because that's what I be calling people. I'm like, yeah, these new millennials out here doing these things, but they're not new. Millennials are 90s and 80s babies, and I'm like, really? And when I thought about Gen Z, I'm thinking, well, maybe this is like 2020, 2018, 2017. This is when it came up, but Gen Zs are 2010s on over. Now we're in the new thing called Generation Beta. And I'm like, wow. And I would have never guessed because as a person, you don't really look into stuff like this, and you don't really, you know, do your research of this. You just think, oh, millennials, you're a millennial, you're a millennial. You think in 2005, 2010, 2000, you're a millennial. You was born in the new millennial. You're a millennial. You was born in the late 90s and grew up in the early 2000s. You're a millennial. And you would have never thought that that's basically what Gen Zs are. And I'm like, there's a lot. But I always tell people, do your research. And a friend of mine was telling me, you got to do your research on a lot of things before you speak upon. And that's why a lot of the times when I do these episodes, especially when I do history in South Florida, or I do, iconic places, or I go to hotspots in South Florida, I always like to do my history on certain things because I like to know about these things before I can. A lot of these places and a lot of these things, they may not have information on it. Like, I've been to several places where I've tried to find information on them, and they give me different types of information to where I can't do it. So I go and I say and do with the best of my ability to, give out information that I can, because you can't get information from it. But with this, I never really thought about, that. And when I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and then I said, okay, and I had a conversation at work, and I said, okay, let me do an episode about this, because I did my research, and I'm like, I would have never guessed that all of this exists, because I know some of y'all was probably thinking the same way I was thinking, oh, millennials? I thought millennials was like 2000 babies and stuff like that. You was born like in the late 90s, early 2000s. You was born in the late 90s, raised in the 2000s. I'm thinking those are millennials, and now, for the past couple of years, we've been in the Gen Z area, and I'm like, wow. And then I didn't know there was anything from baby boomers, because I know baby boomers was back in the 50s and 60s and stuff like that, so I didn't think that I know that's what baby boomers, because I used to see commercials about it, about, are you a baby boomer that was born in this and that? I'm like, baby boomers? And then I didn't really know what that meant, and now with technology out, there are a lot of things, well, no, now you know this and you know that and stuff like that. So it came to past that, now you're wondering, what are we really? Because I always thought that I was a millennial when I first started, because when I recently thought, that I always, they said millennials are 80s babies. And I'm like, okay, I'm a millennial. And then I did my research. Millennial is 1981. And I'm like, so I'm not a millennial either. I'm like old school. Because, anything, 80s babies are considered old school. Anything before 80s is considered old school. Meaning, you got songs, the Teddy Pendergrass, the Marvin Gaye's, the Spinners, the Temptations, things like that. Old school. Old school is, Stephanie Mills, Patti LaBelle, Luther Vandross, stuff like that. Because those are 80s. They had songs in the 80s. Old school, you talking about the OJs and the Stylistics and the Manhattans and all that stuff. But, and then when you think about old school, you think about, Saved by the Bell, the Cosby Show, A Different World, Full House, Married with Children, stuff like that. Old school, you think about Leave It to Beaver, let me see, what is another old school? Good Times, Sanford and Son, old school. You think about Andy Griffin Show, I Love Lucy. You think about, so when you think about stuff like that, you don't think of it as okay, this and that. But I old school is 80s. Old school is the 70s. Old school is basically 60 on down the line. And you think about that, and I didn't think I was old school, because I'm thinking I'm 80s baby. I'm just old school, but I'm old school because I'm a um I'm a Gen X, and I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't even make the cut. I'm not I'm not even 19. I'm grateful for being a 1980s baby, but I didn't even make the cut for millennials. I was like borderline millennial, and I'm like, yeah, I may not act like I may act like a millennial, but I'm a Gen X, and I'm like, okay, I didn't even make the cut. When you go on that team and you thought you could make the cut, and then you was 1 point or one thing off, and it was like, oh, you almost had it, but you didn't make the team or you didn't make the cut. And I'm like, yeah, that's just me. That's how it is. But and and I'm not devastated. I know things happen, and I know this is life. But I would have thought that I was a millennial. But yeah, let me know what you are. Are you a millennial? Are you a Gen Z? Are you a baby boomer? Do you have any kids that are in these eras and stuff like that? I know there should be nobody. I mean, the silent generation. I know that's where my mom is from, so I know there's a lot that may not, you know, because my mom, she's not into technology. Not saying that there's a lot of people that's not into technology, because my mom doesn't know how to use a computer and things like that, because she's a silent generation. She was born in the early 40s. Of course, she's not hip to technology. And if you're way before then, I'm like, ooh, because there's a lot behind it. So I want to know what yours is. Comment at the bottom of this page. You can also email me roundtable00@yahoo.com, because this is something, it may not be a serious topic that most of you would think about doing or talking about, but this is something that's interesting, because we are labeling ourselves through our generations. Each generation, we're labeling ourselves. We're not labeling our zodiac signs, because that's the month that we was born, but we're labeling ourselves through generations. And I'm a Gen X, and that's something interesting. And I thought I was a millennial, and I was just 1 point off, which is 1 year off of me. And if I would have waited at least, and I'm not gonna give you my age, and if I would have waited just a few months, I could have been a millennial. But I ended up being a late Gen X. But that's all I'm gonna say. That's all I'm gonna say. I probably have told you my birthday in the past episodes, but I was a late Gen X, and if I would have waited a few months, I would have been a millennial. But I'm proud to be an '80s Gen X. So it is what it is. But hey, we all are different from who we are, and things like that. But let me know what you think about this. Comment at the bottom of this page. You can also email me at roundtable00@yahoo.com. Let me know, do you talk like this? Because a lot of people, I'm a Gen Z or I'm a millennial. Do you talk like this? To let people know, what era you come from. Because we don't say, oh, I'm, back in the day we used to say, oh, I'm an '80s baby or I'm a '90s baby. Even though some people still do that, but now, the new term is, I'm a Gen Z or I'm a millennial. Or my mom was a baby boomer and things like that. So do you talk like that? Do you say things like that? Just let me know. This is not a serious topic, but it is an interesting topic that I want to talk about, because I see that a lot of people talk about these things, and this is what people refer themselves now these days, as Gen Zs and millennials and baby boomers and things like that. So let me know, and I thank you for watching this episode, and don't forget to check out my other episodes. Don't forget to click and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to check out Hotspots in South Florida, where we visited different cool things to do in South Florida, from Palm Beach all the way to Miami. Don't forget to check out History South Florida, where we visit a lot of historical places, whether if it's houses, historical buildings or shopping centers or parks or wherever we go to, we go and visit them. Don't forget to check out Food Review South Florida, where we get to go to different local restaurants and do reviews on their foods. Not nationally chained restaurants, not Burger King, not McDonald's, but restaurants that are local here, that are mom and pop or chained mom and pop restaurants, and we check them out and do our reviews on them. And don't forget to check out Traveling with the Roundtable, as I visited several other cities beyond South Florida, and I visited different locations and things like that. So this is the Roundtable Talk. I am your host, C Money. As always, I want you to stay safe, Stay blessed, stay hydrated, and whatever generation you're in, let me know, because I need somebody else who's in the Gen X, you know. But take care, and I will see you in the next episode. And see you next time. Take care.